It was in March 1949 that Kim Il-sung had informed Stalin of his plans to conquer South Korea. Stalin, busy with European expansion plans, gave wary support and handed Kim over to Defense Minister Bulganian to help with military equipment. A month later, Kim shared his plans with Communist Party Chairman Mao Zedong, asking for the same support. Mao was occupied with consolidating his victory over the Chinese nationalists in the mainland, but also provided guarded but important bolstering. Then, the U.S. blundered. In January of 1950, American Secretary of State Dean Acheson spoke to the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., outlining the West's perimeter of defense. Because neither MacArthur nor the Joint Chiefs had identified Korea as a vital interest, he left Korea out of the picture. The omission pealed like thunder in the communist world.
Kim again asked for support. Stalin got in touch with Mao, and the immediate question was, what will the Americans do? And their collective judgment was that the Americans would do nothing.
It is almost inconceivable that the massive size of the invasion forces building up across the North Korean border could have been missed by Western intelligence. But despite the loud warnings of lonely individual voices, it was.
The United States had armed South Korea's army as little more than a constabulary, really a peacekeeping or a police force. Part of that reason was the fact that the intelligence supplied by the Central Intelligence Agency about the North Koreans was totally flawed. A few short months before the war, they were carrying only 36,000 troops in the North Korean army. The fact is there were 136,000 troops. Virtually no information about the large number of tanks, well over 170 first-line tanks that the North Koreans had.
Kim confidently informed Mao that the army had promised the conquest would be complete in 2 to 3 weeks. He did not expect to need any open help from his brother communists. The early morning of June 25, 1950, saw Korea's 38th parallel rock with a crushing North Korean artillery and mortar barrage. 7 combat-ready divisions, supported by an armored brigade of Russia's formidable T-34 tanks, achieved complete tactical and strategic surprise. Under a third of the South Korean army was deployed at the front. It possessed less than 6 days' ammunition. More than 200 Russian-supplied Yak-9 fighters and ground attack bombers hurtled at southern targets. Rhee's defending army of 95,000 deliberately denied offensive aircraft, tanks, anti-tank weapons, and heavy artillery were quickly in critical trouble against the Red Armor.
They simply lined these tanks up on these little narrow roads, one behind the other, which in normal conditions would have caused a disaster, and simply started south. And because there was nothing that could stop the tank, the North Korean army actually just blew through the South Korean army, and that's what made it successful in the first stages of the war.
Led by their invincible tanks, 4 communist spearheads drove south through gaps in the hills. The communist divisions were supported by 1,600 guns as their forces surged down the ancient invasion route of the Ui-Janbu corridor. The southern towns and cities began to fall, and the North had the southern capital of Seoul in its sights. Not since the attack at Pearl Harbor had the United States experienced such utter bewilderment and unpreparedness. The attack had been proceeding for 9 hours before President Truman was informed. The newspapers were blaring information before the government had it.
We figured that with the dawn of atomic warfare and jet bombers that we would not need ground forces and close combat forces. We were dead wrong. We had allowed our fighting forces to deteriorate, to be downsized and eliminated, and to be under-equipped and poorly equipped.
That America had its military giant of World War II in the Pacific on hand in Tokyo, just a few hundred miles from the fighting, was not as reassuring as it seemed. The mighty five-star hero, who was now supreme commander in the Far East, was as unprepared as anyone. That General Douglas MacArthur's thin American forces occupying Japan were just a shell of a fighting army was in great measure his fault. Training, equipping, and conditioning had been all but totally ignored in the endless tours of bars, officers' clubs, and geisha houses in a comfortable, subjugated Japan. The American leadership scrambled to react to the North Korean attack. The American policy, called the Truman Doctrine, seemed to call for American support of anti-communism without commitment of forces. But the feisty American president who made the policy could interpret it any way he wanted.
There's no telling what a president of the United States is going to do. And Harry Truman, despite his doctrine, despite what his Secretary of State had stated in terms of Korea being outside of our defensive sphere, said, by golly, this is not going to stand and we're going to kick these fellows back. So he turned topsy-turvy, a policy that had been very, very carefully crafted for about 3 or 4 years. He kicked that out the window in 1 minute when he told Douglas MacArthur to go after these guys.
There was one more force that no national politician could ignore, and it did as much to drive America into this unexpected, unwanted bloodbath as anything in the whole sorry tragedy.
Unless we make sure that there's no infiltration of our government, then just as certain as you sit there, in the period of our lives, you will see a red world.
As the North Korean surprise juggernaut shredded the South's sadly deficient defenses in late June of 1950, the Truman administration found itself impelled to action. Action anchored in principle and played against a background of bitter controversy within the nation's government. When the communist forces of Mao Zedong had driven Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist army off the Chinese mainland to the island of Taiwan in 1949, howls of rage began in America. The so-called China lobby were demanding, who lost China?
The wartime propaganda right from 1937 right until the fall of China was focused on the nationalists as being the hope for a democratic and unified China. And then all of a sudden, out of the mountains comes the Eighth Route Army, these communists, and in no time they have conquered the country. They couldn't believe that Chiang's venality and corruption and the weakness of the nationalist government was to fall because we had told how well they had done. So there must have been another reason. The other reason was because they were betrayed by American statesmen who were really secret communists. And this was something that Joe McCarthy was able to traffic on.
Even if there are only one communist in the State Department, that would still be one communist too many.
Senator McCarthy's vitriolic accusations of treason would not be lightly ignored in any decision for resolute action against what was seen as a red onslaught.
What the president thinks his job is.
While Rhee begged the United States for help, the Americans asked for a meeting of the UN Security Council to consider moves against the aggression. No Soviet veto would materialize because the Soviet delegate, Yakov Malik, had, on January 13th, walked out of the council to protest the UN refusal to seat Communist China in place of the Chinese nationalists. He was still absent on June 25th. A UN resolution condemning the attack and calling for North Korean withdrawal was passed by a unanimous vote. The United Nations was going to war.
I think the United Nations response to the invasion of South Korea is probably the greatest hour in terms of the United Nations lifetime, in terms of its response to aggression. And 16 nations sent forces to fight in Korea.
Although the troops, ships, and air forces of the Allied nations that joined the United States were small in comparative numbers, they included the cream of many hallowed fighting units and would acquit themselves bloodily and gloriously.
One of the first things the U.S. Navy did, in league with the other 9 navies that were involved, was to establish absolute control of the sea in the Yellow Sea and the Sea of Japan. We could use that control of the sea for carrier strikes along the length of the Korean coastline, for naval gunfire, that is bringing destroyers and battleships and the other gunfire ships close aboard and firing on targets ashore. We could use our carriers for close air support of our troops in battle.
The fleet also became a powerful weapon of policy.
Truman had pretty much written off Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists and Taiwan. He thought Taiwan would fall at any moment to the communists. Well, when the Korean War developed, it changed it overnight. And Truman figured that he could not afford to lose Taiwan because of the perception of the peoples in the area and the people in the world that the Western position was falling. So he dispatched the 7th Fleet from Subic Bay. They were en route to Korea to be involved in the operations there, but on the way they passed by Taiwan and they sent 29 aircraft into the strait between Taiwan and the mainland to signal Mao Zedong that we would not stand for an invasion of Taiwan. That was one of the things that concerned Mao Zedong at the outset of the war, that this was not just an effort by the United States in Korea to contain what was happening in Korea, but it was actually part of a concerted effort to undermine the communist government in Beijing.
Just 2 days after the attack, the Republic of Korea government and Army headquarters and the U.S. Embassy and Military Advisory Group were leaving Seoul to move south. The American advisors tried desperately to stop the South Koreans from destroying the bridges over the River Han before thousands of its soldiers and civilians could cross to safety. But with disgraceful callousness and incompetence, the bridges were blown while loaded with the fleeing. As many as 800 people died, and much of the crumbling Republic of Korea army was trapped north of the Han. The retreating troops that were finally able to float across the river did so without transport, supplies, and what heavy weapons they had. Organization was vanishing. Seoul fell by the 28th. Of the 98,000 men in the ROK Army, 34,000 were already killed, captured, or missing. The scraped-together, obsolescent aircraft of the U.S. Far East Command provided the only instant help available to the reeling South Koreans. And there were big problems.
The North Koreans advanced so rapidly that they overran a lot of the available airfields and a lot of the areas where we could have used emergency airfields in the south. And so we were reduced very, very quickly from the United States Air Force standpoint to providing combat power from Japan.
Although the old World War II P-51s, Corsairs, and B-26s joined the early jets to gain air control and make the roads of Korea an increasingly costly place for the enemy to be, the North Koreans deigned to hide their tanks because the mere sight of them sent the ROK forces fleeing. By June 30th, MacArthur had personally inspected the disintegrating front and quickly demanded U.S. ground forces to be committed to the peninsula. 4 infantry divisions, the 24th, 25th, 2nd Infantry, and 1st Cavalry, were dispatched to Korea. The administration discarded the idea of a declaration of war, deciding this to be a mere police action. An appalling number of young policemen stepping ashore in Korea would not leave this unknown land alive. If Americans had any doubt that they were in a real war in Korea, it was dispelled by a call-up of reserve units and an extension of the military draft. Truman's decision to fight enjoyed wide public support, but not necessarily among the public that was going to fight, especially the World War II veterans and reservists.
They were desperate for bodies in Korea in those days. The units that were in the fighting was all under strength and desperate, and many people said, well, they'll never send Pratt because he has 10 campaigns in 3 years in frontline duty in World War II. Suddenly my orders for Korea came in.
I was a reservist, and the reservists were what you might call the Minutemen of this century.
As so often through history, luck granted America a first-rate top leadership at a critical moment. Truman was tough, smart, decisive, and always open to good advice. And he got plenty of that from his Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, the brilliant George Marshall, and Omar Bradley, head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. All had been hardened in the political and military forge of World War II. As for MacArthur, the old giant seemed 10 years younger, for he now saw it as his destiny not just to stop an aggression, but to use all the weapons and power of the United States to confront and utterly defeat all of world communism on this battlefield. That such a war might expand and run out of control and into atomic war did not concern him, and many shared his view.
The question of whether America would use atomic weapons in the execution of this war was not a major debate. Only 5 years earlier, we had used 2 of our weapons effectively to end World War II. We didn't have this large buildup of aversion to that type of warfare. It was just one more weapon in our inventory that we could use effectively.
Would the Russian and Chinese giants intervene? Korea, Japan, Berlin, Taiwan? They had their choice. But the communists had been shocked at how wrong they had been about United States' resolve to defend Korea, and the stakes were too high to be wrong again.
They were chess players and we were poker players, and they found the United States very dangerous because they never knew when we were going to bluff, when we were going to call, and they knew that we had this enormous potential, this enormous firepower to bring to bear.
But it looked like the last thing the North Koreans needed was help. These were first-class fighters with first-class tactics, and it was beginning to look as though the first trickle of American troops beginning to arrive at the southern port of Pusan might be arriving just in time to take part in an Asiatic Dunkirk. The Americans were not ready to fight, much less to win.
Our captain advised us that they did not have any ammunition for us. And if we were attacked, we should go to tent number 4 and get 4 rounds of ammunition and 1 hand grenade. And that's what I remember about the first day I arrived in Korea.
The Army's 24th Infantry Division, thrown piecemeal into battle, bore the brunt of trying to stop the North Korean steamroller. Typical of the near hopeless fight was the fate of what was called Task Force Smith, a lightly armed force of 406 officers and men, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Smith, that was thrown in against a wave of communist troops and tanks. Their outmoded 2.36-inch bazooka rockets bounced off the Russian-made T-34s like BBs. Even direct fire by their few puny 105s was no match for the thick armor. The North Koreans went around them, behind them, and through them. The only thing Task Force Smith could buy with the loss of half its men was 3 days' time. But it was time that was needed beyond all other things. As the 24th tried to delay the main attack, 6 more North Korean divisions were driving back the bloodied ROK army in the mountainous center of the country. On each coast, far from the main attack, the Communists sped south, intent on surrounding the South Koreans and Americans. On the West Coast, the enemy faced only scattered South Korean policemen. The stage was set for one of the greatest encirclements and slaughters of the 20th century. To the bewildered reservists, draftees and World War II retreads, the next weeks were a numbing procession of defeat, retreat, ignorance, and confusion. They saw no more of the war than what was shooting at their own company, squad, or platoon.
Well, I had no idea what was going on. I had no idea where I was. Thank God my wife used to send me clippings from the newspaper. That's what I knew what the shape of Korea was like and where I was, because she put a little arrow and she'd say, this is where you are.
The all-enveloping enemy was well led, determined, and infinitely better equipped. The M-24 light tanks that the United States had landed melted away in the summer heat before the T-34s.
They said, well, heavy tanks can't operate in Korea. And by the time I got there, of course, the T-34 tanks, which were Russian heavy ones, or medium at least, had come down and shot the devil out of everything. And the tank battalion that I joined had lost 11 of their 17 tanks in one day. And by the time I got there, they only had 2 left. The North Koreans were good. They had been well trained. They had one basic tactic, which was when they ran into opposition, they would just overflow to the flanks and get behind us. And pretty soon a unit would be cut off, and you'd have to fight your way back out of it again. I remember the first time I heard the term bug out. A lieutenant was bringing me back up to a position on the Naktong, and he pointed down to a trail, and he said, "That's the bug out route." And I didn't know what that meant. And I pretty soon found that that was a very common term, bug out, meaning they're behind us, better every man for himself. It's a pretty sorry state at that time, but it was understandable.
Those that had good officers performed well, in some cases magnificently. Those who had mediocre or poor officers failed miserably. There was a desperation on the part of the soldiers within those units that had poor leadership, a desperation for decent leadership. It takes a very skilled unit to do a withdrawal well, because you have to do it in echelon, moving one echelon through another one and committing successive delays. You have to be a top-notch professional to do it, and the forces that we had in the early weeks of the war in Korea were not professional by any stretch of the imagination.
The retreat south to the Naktong River became so desperate that Major General William Dean found himself fighting as a bazooka man to dam the red tide. With telephone wires cut and radios failing, Dean picked up some survivors of Task Force Smith and fought in disarray. Withdrawals without orders began, with equipment abandoned. Repeatedly, a raging Dean relieved wavering officers and tried to stabilize his blocking positions. Dean would finally be taken prisoner and endure a bitter confinement. Marguerite Higgins of the New York Herald Tribune wrote, "I saw young Americans turn and bolt in battle, or throw down their arms, cursing their government for what they thought was embroilment in a hopeless cause." The night seemed blacker than ever for the UN forces, but a new dawn was coming closer. As the North Koreans continued to drive the UN forces southward toward the sea in the middle of the searing July of 1950, the Communists were about to find out that the pursuers' position could also deteriorate quickly and insidiously.
The North Koreans' only weakness as they swept further and further south down the peninsula was the increasing vulnerability of their long lines of supply. Now, true, their troops could live, they boasted, on 3 rice balls a day, but it was still an army, and a mechanized army at that. They needed fuel and ammo and repair parts and people.
Especially, they needed people. The staggering UN forces, with the South Koreans bearing the brunt of the fight, were inflicting more fearful casualties upon their onrushing enemy than anyone suspected. Air power had begun to make the daylight hideously dangerous. And new 3.5-inch bazookas and harder-hitting tank guns were beginning to slice through the North's dwindling armor. The Communists had sustained 58,000 casualties. Just as ominous for the Reds, the blood of the UN armies had bought enough time to bring an increasingly decisive sea lift of men and material across the water to Pusan for the fast-compressing defensive perimeter. Coordinated combat leadership began to fall into place. General Walton Walker, sawed-off and salty and a highly regarded combat veteran of World War II, arrived to take charge of 8th Army Ground Forces, American, Korean, and Allied. MacArthur was formally appointed Commander-in-Chief of the United Nations Command, and Syngman Rhee placed all his forces under UN leadership. The North also exacerbated its own growing troubles. News filtering out of the conquered territory told of an unspeakable North Korean butchery turned loose against entire villages of Koreans suspected of Southern sympathies. The atrocities did not stop with the civilians. In mounting counterattacks to slow the advance, the Americans found that the North Koreans had bound with barbed wire and then murdered American prisoners. Instantly, U.S. soldiers fought harder, both from rage and the realization that surrender offered little safety. A United States Army trained to fight in a materiel-rich network of supporting arms was unable to come to grips with having its flanks hanging in the air. Enemy success would solve their problem. The key city of Taichung fell, and the enemy hooked around it, sweeping toward Pusan from both the north and the west. Now the UN forces tucked themselves backward behind a loop of the Naktong River and upon the final piece of high ground before the Korean Straits. This formed the suddenly solidified defensive semicircle in the southeast corner of the Korean peninsula to go into history as the Pusan Perimeter. The war of maneuver was over. Battered as they were, the Americans were now braced shoulder to shoulder, fighting their kind of war at last. But you could not have told the exhausted soldiers that things were about to get better.
The platoon was down to a handful of men before we got our replacements. I think only 3 of the original platoon were still alive that had landed in Korea.
As you may know, a rifle company is the cruelest organization in the world, because when a new person comes in and needs help and needs guidance and is lost and needs friends in the worst way, no one will talk to him. They won't even speak to him. They'll walk away from him. They don't want to know him. Because unless you've been blooded, you're not part of the unit.
For 6 terrible weeks, the Battle of the Pusan Perimeter raged. Again and again, the enemy seemed on the verge of making the breach in the lines that would carry them to Pusan and a UN apocalypse. But each time, the patchwork defensive lines made the desperate improvisations that held for another day. General Walker ordered, "There'll be no more retreating. This is not going to be a Dunkirk or a Bataan. We must fight to the end."
Stand or die, says Walker. If we don't stand, it will be the greatest bloodbath known to America. This had very little sales appeal for those of us hurrying forward to join the team.
If the battle was raging in place at the front line, it was being inexorably won on the docks of the still open port of Pusan. The potent M26 medium tanks were being unloaded. Heavy artillery, always an American master specialty, began coming ashore in quantity with mountains of shells. And most critically, the men were coming, some of them primed for action. The arrival of the well-trained Air-Ground Marine Brigade, loaded with NCO veterans of World War II, brought in a military professionalism still forming in the units that had been thrown pell-mell into the fighting.
You had to respect the way they did things. They trained as a unit, they stayed as a unit. They had a gung-ho attitude about them, always hung tough. They went down to scramble nets, and we took the gangplank down.
It was a tribute to the headlong ferocity of the North Korean attacks and an indictment of the UN forces that it was still widely held that the perimeter defenders were an outnumbered band beset by limitless hordes of attackers. But the fact was that by now the UN forces before Pusan outnumbered the surviving besiegers. The headlong, near-suicidal nature of the North Korean assault had exposed it to relentless air interdiction by UN air forces. UN airmen held the skies uncontested and grew rapidly in numbers and competence. With envelopment tactics now impossible, the North Korean waves squandered themselves against powerful and well-directed artillery. The ROK units that could once have been counted on to collapse when surrounded were now fighting hard. And while the North was not replacing its losses, the ever-shuttling ships into Pusan were building UN might. Even so, the 95,000 men that Walker disposed on paper were still hard put to defend 130 long miles of perimeter against the skillful and tenacious enemy. A World War II veteran colonel was brutal about his men's continuing shortcomings, saying they'd spent a lot of time listening to lectures on the difference between communism and Americanism when somebody ought to have been telling them how to clear a machine gun when it jams. The U.S. Army has soldiers so road-bound that the soldiers have almost lost the use of their legs. Arriving troops had by now a good idea of what their chances were in the different units, and the infantry was where you didn't want to be.
At the time we arrived at the 2nd Division Replacement Center, where they replaced all the different outfits that were low on men, we knew the infantry was taking very heavy casualties. We had infantry MOS. We were assigned to the artillery. It was like God came down and said, "You will live." We spontaneously formed a circle, like a ring around the rosy, and chanted, "We're gonna make it, we're gonna make it."
On August 31st, the North Koreans gathered all the strength they had left and flung it against a thin, wavering UN line. Their courage was unquestioned. Their tactics, a disaster. In a seesaw battle over the next week, with breakthroughs often inches away, and Walker forced to consider a general withdrawal, the Northerners broke themselves on withering UN firepower. The enemy had snapped the overstretched rubber band of men, food, guns, and ammunition stretching back north. For now, the Pusan perimeter had held. And miraculously, there began to be whispers of a brilliant new offensive operation being put together personally by America's legendary god of war, Douglas MacArthur. By early August of 1950, the Pusan perimeter, barely 50 miles long by 100 miles wide, had been compressed backward into the southeast corner of Korea as far as it would go. The defending forces were now shoulder to shoulder, unflankable, no longer a hodgepodge of green outgunned troops, but an increasingly lethal combat team. And they were supported by the kind of firepower that could be directed against an enemy that had been fought to a halt. By now, MacArthur had deployed 2 more Army divisions from Japan, the 25th and the 1st Cavalry. The Marines arrived as an air-ground team, 5th Marines supported by 2 squadrons of obsolescent but potent F-4U Corsairs and a squadron of F-7 night fighters. MacArthur, the old master of amphibious warfare, had big plans for the Leathernecks.
Incheon was always MacArthur's objective. As early as the second week of the war, he wanted to send the 1st Cavalry Division directly from Japan into Incheon. But the situation turned bad too fast. He had to deploy them into Pusan.
The port of Incheon sat 150 miles to the northwest of the Pusan perimeter, far behind the North Korean lines. It was the key to Seoul and the road and rail junctions that were critical to the enemy's already strained supply lines. With a lightning amphibious landing, American forces stood to cut off and trap the 70,000 communist soldiers besieging the Pusan perimeter. They would be caught between the newly formed 10th Corps to the north and the dramatically enlarging UN Army to the south, already planning its own attack.
MacArthur's strategic concept was brilliant, but MacArthur was the only person who believed that Incheon would work. The hydrographic problems were tremendous. The tactical and technical problems were overwhelming.
The high command officers that MacArthur gathered in Tokyo to confer on the operation were hard-nosed veterans of World War II amphibious warfare in the Pacific. Visions of bloodbath landings at Tarawa and Iwo Jima danced in their heads. The more they heard about Incheon, the less they wanted to land there.
The currents ripped in and out at 7 or 8 knots, as much as the amphibian tractors could make. When the tide was out, there was nothing but mud, and nothing could cross that mud. Not boats, not Amtraks, not men. There would be a 12-hour gap between high tide and high tide. The landing would have to be timed to meet the high tide.
After listening patiently to the litany of impossibilities from his adamant commanders, MacArthur, the master actor, delivered the finest performance of his long career. Slowly, brilliantly, he mesmerized his hardened audience in a sonorous, unwavering voice. His conclusion resonated. I can almost hear the ticking of the second hand of destiny. We must act now or we will die. We shall land at Incheon, and I shall crush them. The Joint Chiefs of Staff agreed to the operation, and by early September, the slow-moving invasion fleet was sailing for Incheon. The 260 ships were crammed with 70,000 C6 soldiers and Marines under the overall command of the Army's Major General Edward Ullman. Desperate to catch the all-important tides, the operation had left much at loose ends.
There was no chance for a rehearsal, no chance for maneuvers, no chance for boat drill, none of the things you think are absolutely essential for an amphibious operation. The amphibious ships were rusting hulks of what we had in World War II. Some of them brought back from the Japanese. Some of them had Japanese crews.
The fortified island of Walmi-do, a natural outpost, would have to be seized first with the morning tide. And then the amphibious task force would have to retreat back down to deep water for another 12 hours until the evening tide to come back to seize the main port of Incheon. That would leave only 2 hours for execution to take a port city the size of Omaha surrounded by 16-foot seawalls. It was very risky, Any major glitch, enemy mines in the channel, bad weather would knock the whole scheme into a cocked hat. Advance operations for the seizure of Incheon began on the 10th of September when Marine corsairs swept over Wolmedo Island and scorched it with napalm. 3 days later, we sent 6 destroyers up that channel to pound the island at close range in broad daylight. This column of destroyers did 2 things for us. First, they blew all the mines out of the channel with their bow guns, and then they suckered the North Koreans into opening fire, goading the gunners into shooting at the destroyers at can't miss range, and we took hits and casualties. And once they revealed their camouflage positions, the ships opened up with their 5-inch guns and blew them right out of their emplacements.
Aboard the transport Mount McKinley, General of the Army's Douglas MacArthur, already a hero of 2 great wars, went on stage in a third to relish what would be his final moment of martial glory and brilliance. For the last time, he watched men in his command go down the scramble nets to face death on a hostile shore. The 5th Marines swept onto a Wolmedo Island writhing under a storm of naval gunfire, rockets, bombs, and napalm. The numbed enemy was swept aside with contemptuous ease. The Stars and Stripes flew over a secure island within the hour. But soon, the tide swept backward to reveal miles of impassable mud flats. For 12 hours, the Marines would have to wait isolated for the return of the sea and the true Incheon landing. From the Mount McKinley, MacArthur flashed, "The Navy and Marines have never shone more brightly than this morning." The expected enemy attempt to dislodge the Marines before the tide flooded back never came. A Marine request to move on their own across the causeway to Incheon was denied. 2:30. The cruisers returned to resume fire on the main waterfront. 4:45. The tide rushed back at last, and landing craft began to haul the rest of the Marine amphibious force to the smoking expanse of the city.
We continued toward what I hoped was the beach. I asked my Amtrak driver if he had a compass. He said, "I don't know." He said, 6 weeks ago I was driving a bus in San Francisco.
"5:31. The first Americans sprang up the ladders onto the seawall, supported by a hail of grenades from behind.
To call them beaches was a misnomer. There were seawalls, stone seawalls, and these would have to be crossed in one way or another. The landing craft were equipped with makeshift scaling ladders.
From 2 invasion beaches, the Marines pushed forward against sporadic resistance. Soon, 8 big LSTs had ground ashore to disgorge the streams of tanks, trucks, jeeps, and stores that solidified the beachhead. In the night, incredibly, no counterattacks came. The day that the inland push was to begin dawned to find that the huge, intricate invasion had been accomplished at a cost of just 20 killed and less than 200 wounded. The 7th Infantry Division and 7th Marines would soon follow ashore for pursuit of the enemy. This cakewalk was not going to last. The troops MacArthur had landed with such spectacular success at Incheon in mid-September now moved into the smoldering ruins of the pounded city. Far from finding a hard-fighting opposition, they were greeted with something like wild joy by the populace that crawled out of the rubble. They hailed their rescue from communist brutality with all their hearts, little realizing how short this deliverance was to be. Now the landed forces linked up and began fanning out toward their objectives. A thrust to capture Big Kimpo Airport was the first vital job of the forming pincer attack that was to cross the Han River and take back Seoul. Opposition became ferocious wherever the enemy could collect himself.
And there we were with our backs up against the dike at the Kalchon Canal. We wanted to cross the canal at a water gate or lock, use that as a bridge. We sent a platoon to cross over to secure that approach. The platoon went over the top just like they would have in World War I. Maxim machine guns on the other side cut loose. The platoon went down. Artillery couldn't fire. Our mortars were too far to the rear, but I had my platoon of heavy machine guns. We blazed away, they blazed away. They gave up first, and we were able to cross the canal.
Enemy forces rushed up for scattered counterattacks, but these were sporadic and unsuccessful. A North Korean armored column racing from Seoul ran into a Marine ambush and lost every tank. On September 18th, Kimpo fell, and Marine corsairs began moving ashore from offshore carriers to support the advance on Seoul. The northern anvil was in place, and the hammer had begun to swing toward it from the south. One day after the Incheon landing, General Walton Walker ordered the 8th Army to begin its breakout from the Pusan perimeter. After sustaining 20,000 casualties to this point, Walker's forces, rebuilt, resupplied, and reinforced, surged across the Naktong River that had served them so well in defense. The going was slow and clumsy at first, but commanders took the initiative to cross with swimmers, captured enemy boats, and underwater bridges built of sandbags.
Colonel Stevens, who was the 21st Infantry commander, stood up on the flatbed of a truck and said, "There's been a landing at Incheon, and we've got a lot of people behind us, and just keep going. When you cross that river and you just keep going north, and if it hit anything, just don't worry about it. We've got others to overflow." It was a great moment.
For the first few days, the North Korean army that had been besieging the perimeter fought a good rearguard action, falling back in a semblance of military order. They didn't understand yet how serious their situation had become.
Especially soldiers, when they are surrounded or cut off, will want to run. The North Korean commander around the Pusan perimeter recognized this and very brilliantly did not tell the army that the Incheon invasion had taken place. It took about a week for the news to filter down to the army, and when it did, then the army disintegrated.
The challenge for the combat troops at that time was to try to find and keep up with the North Koreans. They were withdrawing in panic. They were melting into the woodlands. They were shedding their uniforms and picking up civilian clothes and merging in with the little villages as we went along.
When we started moving north, we saw some abandoned equipment, burned out tanks. We saw weapons that had been discarded. And of course, there were many bodies lying on the field where our Air Force had done a good job of preparing the way for us.
The hours of disorganized enemy resistance were ending for the Incheon forces. After the Marines had ground their way across the Han in LVT landing craft, the North Koreans began a street-by-street battle for Seoul. MacArthur didn't need to go that fast and hard into the capital city of Seoul. He could have sealed off the city and cut the lines of supply to the south and driven all the way across the peninsula to the east coast. This would have created an anvil for the 8th Army to hammer against in cutting off the whole North Korean army in the south.
MacArthur knew that politically the center of gravity was a recapture of Seoul, the capital. He also wanted that done to coincide with the 3rd-month anniversary of the North Korean invasion.
And the result was that about 30,000 of the North Korean soldiers were able to escape and reform the North Korean army back in North Korea.
All the strategy Marines in Seoul had to think about was clearing out the next house, the next block. Marine beach assault troops were fighting a city street battle right out of Northern Europe in World War II.
My company was part of the battalion that was assigned to move up Mapo Boulevard in Seoul. You can compare that to moving up Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington or Fifth Avenue in New York. The boulevard was interlaced with rice bag barricades. Every 100 yards or so, there was a fortified position. So we had to take those barricades or go around them. And I heard tanks coming down Maupeou Boulevard toward us. I gave a mechanized warning, a flash warning. The lead tank fired its first round. It went by me, it killed my radio operator. Now, you're not supposed to be able to engage tanks with .30 caliber machine guns, but believe me, we did. Before the night was over, the foxholes were knee-deep in shell casings. We figured the next morning that we'd have fired 30,000 rounds.
With the 1st Marines under smothering attack, an Army artillery battalion put a wall of 155mm shells against an oncoming wave of enemy tanks. The voice of Marine legend Colonel Chesty Puller graveled over a radio. "I don't know who in the hell you are, but thank God. Out." MacArthur wasn't going to let a little thing like street fighting interrupt his victory deadline. Minutes before midnight, there was an announcement that the capital had been captured. The men still battling in the blazing ruins could only shake their heads. The Associated Press reported, "If this city is liberated, the remaining North Koreans don't know it." On September 27th, the Marines raised the stars and stripes over the city, and Seoul was liberated by the Incheon invaders. Diplomatically, Old Glory was soon supplanted by the blue flag of the United Nations. On the same day, 12 days after the Incheon landing, the beachhead forces made the first link-up with Task Force Lynch, a lead element of the 1st Cavalry Division that had fought the 106 miles north in an astonishingly headlong run led by tanks. There seemed nothing able to stop this steamroller, short of North Korea's border on the Yalu River.
On the 29th of September, MacArthur made his triumphal re-entry into Seoul, bringing President Syngman Rhee back to his capital. The preparations for MacArthur's arrival were considerably more elaborate than those for the Incheon landing.
Victory. Aggression halted. But where was the dancing in the American streets? Where were the preparations for the welcome home parades? Nowhere. Because this was the Cold War, and its battlefields were still stretching out across the world. The reservations were well-founded, as men in Washington, Tokyo, and Peiping began a string of disastrous judgments.
Now you come to the original border, the 38th parallel. Do you stop there, or do you keep on going? Well, if you stop there, all you're doing is establishing the original boundary, and you're not punishing the aggressor. So there was a strong desire to finish these guys off in keeping with our military tradition that you win a war, you don't take half measures. So there was this tremendous pressure within the American public to do that. And Douglas MacArthur, of course, wanted to do it. He felt that he wanted complete victory also, and the way you got complete victory was to go to the Yalu River and unite all of South Korea under the democratic government of Syngman Rhee.
Needless to say, neither MacArthur nor his government consulted with the exhausted, bloodied soldiers who thought they had just won the war and bought a quick, safe ticket back to God's country. MacArthur in victory was much changed from the first tense moments of the triumphant Incheon invasion. Then his insistently repeated question was, "Have we heard anything of the Russians or Chinese?" Now his assurance grew. Moscow and Peiping had folded. Options to go north, as already discussed and studied, seemed wide open. Republic of Korea troops were advancing north of the 38th parallel by October 1st. The doubts that had loomed before Incheon began to melt. Military advisors who had been dubious started to jump on the bandwagon going north. That this was a legitimate United Nations war aim became widely accepted. Proposals to invade with ROK troops only were brushed aside. George Marshall had become Secretary of Defense. Marshall joined Acheson and Truman in the decision to pursue the enemy to destruction. Military problems that should have concerned them didn't.
MacArthur's forces were very ill-disposed for an attack into North Korea. The reason was that the Joint Chiefs of Staff, even though they had been planning such a move since July, failed to tell the commander. MacArthur was not informed that he was to cross the 38th parallel until September 27th, 12 days after the Incheon landing.
The complex, inefficient plan rushed into place in 48 hours, pulled the 10th Corps out of Seoul, and re-embarked them for another end-around amphibious assault. The Marines were to leave from Incheon and sail all around Korea to invade the port of Wonsan. The 7th Division was to move from Seoul to Pusan and embark to invade Iwan. The exhausted 8th Army would be called to fight 450 miles up the entire length of Korea. 8th Army Commander Walton Walker considered the plan absurd, pointing out that UN forces were racing up the East Coast right now virtually without opposition, and there would be an immense loss of time and cohesion in the plan's clumsy logistics. Walker's temper was not improved by his co-commander, General Almond, now reporting directly to MacArthur. Like most World War II fighting officers, he deeply distrusted a divided command. Since mid-August, there had been overlooked but solid indicators of Chinese intentions. The New York Times reported the Russians meeting with Mao to agree that China would enter the war if the UN crossed the 38th parallel. Most ominously, Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai had sent a plain message through the Indian diplomats stating flatly China would come in if U.S. troops violated the boundary. But Truman sniffed at what he called a political ploy by a leftist India. Washington was not so concerned with China's warnings as to delay the advance of the 8th Army into North Korea on September 10th. Everybody had become sure that the Russians, with their hands full subjugating Eastern Europe, would never permit their Chinese puppet to begin a distracting and costly war. It never occurred to them that China was nobody's puppet. Or that on October 8th, Mao had ordered Chinese People's Volunteers to resist what he called the acts of U.S. imperialism. The advancing armies met serious resistance from the North Koreans for just the first week, and then the enemy broke in body and spirit. A disorderly retreat began. The push toward the Yalu became something of a road race. Increasingly, prudent rules of military advance and troop disposition began to be neglected.
MacArthur had just finished the incredible job of winning the battle at Incheon. He immediately thereafter set in motion a very wrong-headed approach to capture North Korea. He divided the army into the 10th Corps, which is east of the great mountain divide of Korea, and the 8th Army to the west of it. And the result was that neither could help the other.
At the height of this crucial military pursuit, MacArthur was annoyed to be summoned to a conference at Wake Island in the mid-Pacific by his commander-in-chief. At the October 15, 1950 meeting, MacArthur displayed all the charm and deference he customarily employed around politicians. He apologized for anything he had said that might embarrass the administration. Both men would describe the meeting as cordial. It possibly passed MacArthur by that the president might be trying to open communications that would prevent any more misunderstandings about the general's right to state independent political positions. all MacArthur would promise was this: formal resistance will end throughout North and South Korea by Thanksgiving. The men skipped lunch and left. The meeting had taken just 2.5 hours. On October 9th, Pyongyang, the North Korean capital, fell to the Eighth Army as the enemy pulled back into the northern vastness. The war was clearly going to end in a matter of weeks. Soldiers began to discuss their post-war assignments. For too many, there would be no post-war. The breakaway UN thrusts into crumbling North Korean forces in the autumn of 1950 seemed to sail toward victory. The mine-delayed Wonsan landing of the Marines turned out to be as useless as Walker had predicted. The sheepish Marines came ashore to a warm welcome from ROK troops, who already had elements 50 miles north. The Iwan landing accomplished just as little. Ashore, the Leathernecks found ugly things.
We went into the town, we found there was a South Korean battalion there. In the center of the little town were about 50 prisoners, military-age Koreans in civilian clothes, hands tied behind their back, and they were being executed one by one. I told our interpreter, tell that major to knock that off. He said, I can't do it. He would lose face. I had an inspiration. I said, tell the major that if he wants to get back to Wonsan before dark, he has to get on these trucks now. The major looked at me, gave me a nasty sort of grin. He knew what I was doing. He said, all right, all right. So they climbed on the trucks, drove away. And I was left with the prisoners and the dead ones.
On October 20th, MacArthur, now acting under instructions from Washington that he was to feel unhampered tactically and strategically, prepared a maximum effort to move to the northern border. MacArthur's campaign for total victory began on November 24th. Unopposed at first, the Eighth Army began crossing the Chongchon River. 100 miles to the east, across Korea's mountainous spine, the smaller 10th Corps continued its multi-fingered approach north. The Communist powers, humiliated by the unexpected reverse at Incheon, would not let this blot on their seemingly inevitable march to the top of history continue. Korea, China, and the Soviet Union had conferred constantly and clandestinely. Timetables and forces for intervention were in place as early as October 16th. 2,500 soldiers of the Chinese 370th Regiment crossed the Yalu and deployed near the Chosin and Fusen dams. On October 20th, a Chinese task force known as the 56th Unit sent 5,000 troops over the Yalu near the Suiho Dam. A great tide was beginning to flow unseen.
The Chinese developed a system of being able to infiltrate across the Yalu River and not be discovered whatsoever by American air power, that is, by air intelligence. They did this by wearing camouflage uniforms, by not moving except at night, and if an airplane came over, they were required to stand still until the plane moved on.
The division was moving up into the high ground, up into the mountains beyond Hungnam. 7th Regiment was in the lead. First week of November, they began to run into Chinese. They reported this. No one took it very seriously. The story in Tokyo was that these were Chinese volunteers. We soon learned that they were not. They were the 124th CCF Division.
General Walker remarked, "After all, there are a lot of Mexicans in Texas."
It was rather heavy fighting moving up Funchal Pass up into this plateau and to Chosin Reservoir. As a company commander, I had the feeling that we were moving too far and too fast. We made a wild ride, our battalion, up through the pass, across the plateau to Hagaru-ri.
The geography of the stretch of northeast Korea through which the 10th Corps in the east advanced was made to order for ambush. A single narrow road bounded by commanding high ground on both sides stretched up from the port of Hungnam. American forces were strung out all along it, many of the onrushing units paying little attention to the prudent rules of military advance. The towns along the road, Koto-ri, the junction of Hagaru-ri, and the hill town of Udam-ni, were about to take grim places in United States battle history. One commander who closed his ears to the call for unsecured advance was the commander of the 1st Marine Division, Major General O.P. Smith.
The terrain was so bad, and there was just this one line of road that Smith said, "Wait a minute, we're standing in trouble." But everybody else was in a rush to the Yalu so that they could say they had united Korea and would all be home by Christmas. Smith refused to spread his forces out, kept them close in mutual support, and moved very slowly. His boss, the 10th Corps commander, General Amon, was on him and berating him personally and criticizing the Marines for lack of aggression. And O.P. Smith took it all and said, "By God, I'm not going to put my Marines in the position at a disadvantage." And of course, he turned out to be right.
We did not know it, but about 180,000 Chinese soldiers were in the mountains to the north of the Changchang River. When we crossed the Changchang River, these forces attacked us both in the west at the Changchang and also over in the east around the Changjin Reservoir. The attacks were very powerful. They destroyed a South Korean corps, and they shattered a battalion of the 8th Cavalry Regiment.
The attacks separated units and chewed them up piecemeal. Storms of fire from burp guns and mortars created total confusion among the road-bound Americans. The enemy onslaught demonstrated brilliant planning, ability to strike anywhere with surprise, and a willingness to accept heavy casualties to achieve tactical success. Then, at a point where annihilation of the reeling Americans and South Koreans seemed all but assured, the Chinese, inexplicably, turned off the heat.
They marched away from the battlefield. They marched back into the mountains, and they stayed there for 3 weeks without any further action against UN forces at all.
The pause was not a voluntary stop meant to serve as a warning to UN forces, as some would later claim. Mao had unequivocally instructed his commander, Marshal Peng Du-hai, to destroy American and ROK units and drive the UN from Korea. But the simple truth was that even as the Reds were succeeding in attacks against the ground forces, savage UN air attacks on their troops, the bombing and outrunning of their supply lines, had badly mauled the communists. Peng had to pause for a halt to reorganize and re-equip his freezing and exhausted forces. In any case, MacArthur had the bit in his teeth. He was in no way disposed to change his plans to accommodate an intervention whose dimensions remained undefined by hard intelligence.
He said that the only way the war could be ended successfully was to attack all the way to the Yalu River. He insisted, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the President did not force him to go into any negotiations.
MacArthur had hypnotized and intimidated the government of the United States. But China was quite another thing. As November 1950 drew near a close, the mists above the Yalu River were clearly visible to some UN forces advancing to the Manchurian border. But under the snow-blown mists of the eastern mountains, 12 Chinese divisions lay hidden, 120,000 troops. Their objective was the destruction of the 1st Marine Division and a regimental-sized Army task force operating east of the reservoir. But the biggest threat lay in the west, where 180,000 Chinese stalked the advancing 8th Army. Unaware of what lay ahead, the ROK Capital Division sped up the east coast. Elements of the American 7th Infantry Division reached the Yalu. The troops stared across at forbidding Manchuria. A more immediate enemy had already arrived. Sub-zero, subhuman weather came roaring down out of the mountains of north-central Korea to cruelly hamper human and mechanical efficiency.
We were not well equipped for a winter campaign. We had long Navy-type parkas, which were quite unwieldy, and we had something horrible called shoe packs, not intended for Arctic cold.
We continued our advance on up to the area on the west coast and the Chungcheong River Valley north of the town of Kunuri, only about 20 miles from the Yalu River on the Manchurian border. We had our Thanksgiving dinners there in November of 1950.
If the Army's spirit was way up, its guard was way down. The soldiers never dreamed that many of them were eating their last meal. On November 26th, out of a 20-below-zero wind howling out of Siberia, the Chinese struck the 2nd ROK Corps and the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division.
Suddenly, all over us, all around us, were hundreds of Chinese troops who had sneaked up the hill with their little tennis shoes and their quilted uniforms, and suddenly they were on top of us. They were rolling through the night. They infiltrated our positions. They were rolling all around us. We had hand-to-hand fights during the night, massive confusion. It was rapidly realized by the high command that we had to start withdrawing from the area. We withdrew back down to some high ground just south of the river, fighting our way all the way back through night and day. For 3 or 4 days we went without sleep, almost without food, and seldom ever without the Chinese nipping at our heels. We watched the Chinese filter around to our rear, and we got word over the radio that our other 2 regiments, which was withdrawing on the road to the south, had been blocked. And they were in a tremendous firefight. This was the action which was known as the Gauntlet in Korea, where our 9th and 38th divisions from the 2nd Division were slaughtered and almost completely wiped out.
There now began a shock to American arms that would never completely fade. The nation that had never tasted anything but decisive victory at the end of a war had another ultimate triumph not only snatched away, but turned into the longest, bitterest retreat in its military history. At what should have been the crowning moment of a fabulous career, Douglas MacArthur watched his arrogant beliefs in a world that bent to his destiny shattered. As he had at Bataan, the veteran warrior willed insatiably to gain victory and vengeance over his enemies. Washington turned in an instant from a bastion of confidence to a cauldron of consternation and self-doubt. The CIA's earlier report of up to 40,000 Chinese across the border and 700,000 more waiting in Manchuria to strike was now taken as gospel. The leadership clung to the straw of Moscow's not giving Peiping full power to intervene.
We went into the Korean War with the absolute conviction that the Soviet Union was calling all the shots. This is not the case because the Chinese were never a satellite of the Soviet Union.
Ad hoc plans were blurted everywhere. Bomb the Yalu bridges, rattle the A-bomb, call their bluff, bomb Manchuria. Through it all, no one had any notion of the Chinese enemy, his intentions, or his motives.
The Chinese army was almost a guerrilla force. It did not employ any heavy weapons. The largest weapons they employed were mortars, and usually those were not very heavy mortars. We encountered this army with the most sophisticated transportation and weapons that existed on Earth. We were tied to the MSRs, the main supply route, which was the highways, the roads. The Chinese, since they had weapons they could carry on their backs, could come around our forces, could materialize anywhere they wanted to in our rear or on our sides or anywhere else.
We could look out to our flanks, off to the horizon, to the east and to the west, and we could see long black lines of Chinese marching in columns, going around us, ever to our rear. And of course we knew that the only road that we could possibly get out was going to be cut if we didn't get out of there as soon as possible. That was our worry all during the day.
For the second time in 5 months, an American army and its allies were about to be cut off from their supplies and reinforcements and ground to pieces. And this time, the enemy was a huge nation with an army of millions. The December of 1950 that was supposed to produce total UN victory was producing something like disaster. The huge crush of so-called volunteers from China had swept across the Yalu into North Korea to check MacArthur's split and ill-organized American advance with terrifying force and surprise. Day after day, night after night, UN forces found themselves engulfed in an ungodly cacophony, a crescendo of bugles, rattles, whistles, and drums. Against the 8th Army in the west, the Chinese smashed through badly prepared perimeters, overrunning gun lines and rear areas everywhere. Panic was never far away.
Next thing I hear was bug out. So naturally, I start to bug out on the rear, and I slipped. I was sliding down the hill in the snow. And while I'm sliding, I was praying to God that I would stop. I didn't want to get lost, or I didn't want them to leave me, and then I'd be out there. I don't know where. I got the Chinese on one side, and I got the Americans on the other side. And they're trigger happy, and you know, it was just a situation. This is all going through my mind, and I'm praying to God, please let me stop.
On the right of the 8th Army, the whole ROK collapsed, abandoning their tanks, trucks, and weapons in a chaos of retreat. An 80-mile chasm was opening between the 10th Corps in the east and the 8th Army in the west. The Chinese had by now committed 18 divisions.
The tactic we learned of the Chinese in that period of the war was not to hit American units in frontal attacks. Probe around the front lines, find out where the Korean divisions were, the South Korean divisions, and then hit them. They knew that they would collapse. And then the problem for the American units was we had to withdraw to keep from being surrounded and cut off and isolated. The Korean soldiers that fought in our units we found to be very dependable, very reliable, very supportive, and very helpful. But unfortunately, the Koreans in their own army, they were in a state of their national history where they had just emerged for decades of Japanese domination at a time when the Japanese never permitted the Koreans to rise in society to any point of leadership or responsibility.
I look behind and I see traces behind us, and I said, what the hell's going on, you know? And a short while later, the sergeant comes by and says, we're moving out, we're moving out. That's because some outfits on our right and left flanks, they caved in. I could see the Chinese running along the ridge line trying to get ahead of us. And they're shooting at us, and I could see machine guns on the bottom of the road. They're traversing, trying to hit the men.
The order of 2nd Division General Kaiser to move his unit south produced a traffic jam on the narrow road. It moved through a hail of mortar and machine gun fire. Jeeps and trucks slid into ditches, overturned, and spilled the wounded. The passage would be known as the Gauntlet. Wreckage slowed vehicles to where their stunned passengers could be overtaken by Chinese foot soldiers who pulled them down.
The Chinese were beating them up with rifle butts and so forth. I jumped off the vehicle to try to help one fellow there, that one of my troops that was screaming to get back on the truck, and I went down and got him and pulled him up. He was bleeding and wounded, and as I did, I had this crushing blow in the middle of my back, and I went down for the count myself. The Chinese had apparently taken his rifle butt and hit me right between the shoulder blades and almost knocked me out. My head was spinning around and around, but I didn't quite go out, and finally I collected my senses and turned around and kicked him or pushed him or something, got rid of him, and then I climbed on the truck myself, and the convoy continued to move. We had to leave people behind. They were out in the field screaming, "Don't leave me behind, I'm wounded, help, help." There's no way we could help them.
After a 5,000-man Turkish brigade had been cut to pieces trying to protect the escape route, the 2nd Division finally punched through the gauntlet. They had lost 5,000 men and all combat effectiveness. Their retreat was close to a stampede.
As I went through Pyongyang, there was warehouses of sea rations burning and brand new tanks on flat cars that were burning. That's how much of a haste that we were to get out of there.
We went up to Cunari to try to help get the 2nd Division out that the Chinese had surrounded. They let our company come through and they surrounded us. They really didn't set in for a while that we were prisoners.
To the east, in the 10th Corps, where the Chinese had hit on November 27th, they were finding a harder nut to crack. General O.P. Smith had continued to move prudently and had 2 veteran Marine regiments out front at Udam Ni, well supported by tanks and artillery. Even so, 2 regiments were not nearly enough against the Chinese avalanche. The situation grew increasingly critical as the Chinese cut the road south in a dozen places. Smith's 3 tough regimental commanders, Colonels Ray Murray, Homer Litzenberg, and Chesty Puller, led the 5th, 7th, and 1st Marines in frantic fighting to open the way out. Smith was most vulnerable at the road junction at Hagaru-Ri. The airstrip that his engineers had scraped out of its hard frozen soil was to be indispensable to all hopes of getting out of the north alive. Immediately after the Chinese assault, the Marines had found themselves holding 3 isolated perimeters along the narrow road of advance that had now become their lifeline of retreat. The Leathernecks hung on at Udam-ni, farthest north, at Hagaru-ri on the base of the Chosin Reservoir, and at Koto-ri, 10 miles south.
Hagaru-ri had to be held. It was essential. A relief column was formed up at Koto-ri, consisting of a commando of Royal Marines, a company of U.S. Marines belonging originally to our battalion, a company of soldiers, 2 tank companies, and some headquarters personnel from the division. 11 miles from Koto-ri to Hagaru-ri, up a winding mountain road. Commanding this mixed unit was a Royal Marine Lieutenant Colonel, Douglas Drysdale, and the task force was called Task Force Drysdale. Now here is his problem, leading a regimental-sized unit up this valley, up this hill, never been together before. Drysdale had an all-day fight getting to us. They were ambushed again and again. The tanks would stop and fire, then plunge on. The infantry would tumble out of its trucks, get cut up. And in Royal Marine style, they came through as individuals. Drysdale lost a good third of his commando. Then the Marine Company came through, George Company. The Army Company just didn't get there, nor did the headquarters and support people. They'd been taken prisoner.
For the second time in the war, the UN forces had stumbled, blind and unready, into a powerful ambush that threatened to cut them off for certain annihilation. Going into December of 1950, the polyglot force of U.S. Marines, soldiers, and Royal Commandos battled to hold the frozen perimeter at Hagaru-ri. The savage Chinese attacks meant to overwhelm it, close the lifeline airstrip, and seal the road to the evacuation port of Hungnam. East of Chosin, an Army task force under Lieutenant Colonel Don Faith collided with a Chinese division hurrying to surprise Hagaru-ri.
The task force fought bravely, but they were surrounded and overwhelmed, and Colonel Faith was killed in action, and his unit was just swamped by these waves of Chinese. Half of them fell or were captured, but they saved Hagaru-ri for another night.
A veteran Marine said that he had shuddered when he heard the term task force, which he said meant a makeshift collection of vehicles and men committed to disaster. Even among the horrors of the Hagaru perimeter, the arrival of the remnants of the shattered 7th Division was shocking. They came in limping and crawling, ravaged by wounds and frostbite. A Marine wrote, "Some had gone crazy and were walking in circles. It was pitiful." Of the 1,000 survivors of the original 2,500-man Task Force Faith, only 385 were found fit to go onto the line. Some of them remembered how after the Chinese hit, General Almond had been telling his troops, "Don't let a bunch of Chinese laundrymen stop you." Almond had a lot to learn about this unique enemy.
The Chinese army was unique in that it did not have any of the characteristics that we think of in a traditional American army or European army. There was no officer corps. There were not even any ranks. The soldiers addressed their commanders as comrade platoon leader or comrade company commander. It was very much of a people's army. The Chinese soldiers were informed in great detail of their tactical mission and even the strategic mission, and because of this, this contributed a great deal to the success of the Chinese army.
Between Hagaru-ri and Udam-ni, the road was cut by a pass, Toktong Pass, about 4 miles north of Hagaru-ri. That pass was essential to any troop movement down the main supply route. It was being held by a single company, Fox Company, 7th Marines, commanded by Captain William Barber. They held that position for something like 8 days. 2/3 of the company were casualties.
They had been under attack by a Chinese regiment for several days. Lissenberg called me and said, I got 20 minutes to get a plan to go and get them out. Launched out through the mountains. Finally reached a point over where you could see Fox Company. My radio man finally got Fox 6, Bill Barber, on the phone. He said he was going to send some people out to rescue us.
It took the 5th and 7th Marines 79 hours to battle the 14 miles from Udam-ni to Hagaru-ri. Colonel Davis's Ridge Runners had to get off the roads and onto the high hills alongside the roads to eliminate the Reds pouring fire upon them. Fortunately, the Marines were able to pour a special fire of their own out of the skies. Marine Corsairs provided spectacular support in the downward march, strafing and scorching every Chinese concentration in sight. Marines reported being able to see the grinning faces of low-flying pilots. When the haggard, exhausted Udam-ni Marines had at last pounded their way to the Hagaru perimeter, the commander, Ray Davis, was not about to let down the Marines' pride.
There were some Royal Marines that met us on the outskirts, but as we approached, partially at the suggestion of our NCOs, we had the Marines dress ranks, stand tall, walk in like Marines, and that was reflected on the faces of those that we saw when we got there.
They came in route column, and believe it or not, some of them sang the Marine Corps hymn. Of the 15,000 men who went up on the plateau, about 750 were killed, about 4,000 were wounded, and just about everybody had frostbite.
No man engaged in firefights on the ground gained more respect than the daring C-47 pilots who had the temerity to brave the dangers of landings and takeoffs at the pitifully inadequate and fire-swept airstrip that had been scratched out at Hagaru-ri.
There wasn't a man in Korea that did not think that the C-47 pilots were the greatest human beings on earth. The soldiers and Marines that had been wounded could not go down the terrible road back to the sea. Everyone knew this. The Hagaru airstrip then became vital to get these men out. And they took out about 4,500 men in a space of about 2 days, and they did not lose a single man.
With the bulk of their severely wounded safe, the Marines, Royal Commandos, and soldiers now blasted their way out of the encircling Chinese. They left Hagaru-ri in flames and took off toward the sea. Again, they had to go to the ridges to clear the heights of Chinese firing down. All along the way, the close Navy and Marine air support supplied the crucial umbrella of firepower to deny the day to the Chinese. But the pilots' perils went far beyond what ground fire they met from the enemy. Their greatest dangers rose from flying day and night from ice-shrouded aircraft carriers and wind and storm-tossed seas.
Each carrier would fly a 12-hour day. And if we had 3 carriers there, which was not too unusual, we'd stagger that. So there may be an overlap of 6 hours or so when two carriers are operating simultaneously. If the deck happened to be coming up fast or was about to drop out as you got there, you'd get a wave off and you'd be forced to come around again. Two bad things about a wave off. One is that when we came back from our flights, we were usually pretty tired and we were exhausted enough so that we wanted to get aboard as quickly as possible. And the other is we're very often low on fuel. And it's close air support that we enjoyed more than anything else because the troops were right there and we were doing everything we could to help them.
O.P. Smith would never call his retrograde movements a retreat. His forces were slamming through opposition at every step, and they were moving in good military order. Retreat, hell, he growled. We're just attacking in another direction. But simply reaching Hungnam and evacuation with full unit integrity was the bitter goal. Being driven off a beach in any kind of order was something that hadn't happened in the history of the Marine Corps. Supplies straggled into the besieged Hagaruri perimeter by air, as the wounded went out on the same planes. The cold never relented. Corpsmen held morphine syrettes in the warmths of their mouths to keep the opiate usable. Small rations were preferred because they could be thawed easiest against the troops' armpits and bellies. On December 6th, the 15,000 soldiers, Marines, and commandos and their 1,500 vehicles began the 11-mile march from Koto Ri to Hungnam. Puller, the belligerent commander of the 1st Marines, hopped onto a ration box and snarled, "I don't give a good goddamn how many Chinese are between us and Hungnam. There aren't enough in the world to stop a Marine regiment going where it wants to go." The usual brilliant close air support helped make Chesty's boast come true.
I remember standing in Hagaruri and watching it strike against this snow-covered hill. My runner was standing next to me, and we could see these bombs exploding, a flash of orange red, and then black mark on the snow. And my runner said, "Like a giant bird taking a crap."
Non-Marine commanders were appalled by the Leatherneck's grim insistence in the midst of crisis in bringing out their frozen dead from the reservoir.
Our reply was, "We came up here like Marines and we are coming out like Marines. We will bury our dead and we will get out our wounded."
The fight from Koto Ri to Hungnam was a duplicate of what had happened all the way south. Clearing the ridges, clearing the crippled vehicles, clearing the refugees. Then, suddenly, a stunning problem. The Chinese had looped ahead and blasted a key bridge over a deep, wide culvert in Funchalen Pass. The UN column was in a bottle. Coolly, Lieutenant Colonel John Partridge, the divisional engineer officer, flew over the gap in a helicopter, making hurried notes on what he needed to provide an emergency bridge. In short hours, he had not only worked out, but tested a way to parachute sections of a prefabricated treadway bridge. Half of the 8 airdrop sections smashed on impact, but Partridge only needed 4 to span the gap. They took 3 excruciating hours to install in the bitter cold. The column began to move forward again. On December 10th, the troops reached Hungnam, where a great amphibious armada waited to take them off. Even with salvation in sight, many Marine senior officers contemplated sheltering under the big guns of the fleet and holding the port through the winter as an abscess to the rear of the enemy lines of communication. But they had their orders from Tokyo. Leave. MacArthur had had his fill of desperate sieges. All the men of the remaining forces that had seemed trapped in the east were now loaded onto the ships. There were 100,000 men of the U.S. Army and Marines and ROK units, along with 100,000 desperate refugees. Amid an orgy of civilian looting of the richest supply depot north of Pusan, the demolition men did their work. The enemy would find nothing of use in the warehouses of the ravaged port or its facilities.
When we got aboard ship, I watched them blow up the whole land. And the sight I seen there, I'll never forget as long as I live.
As the troops moved ashore, the heavy guns of the fleet laid down a rolling barrage to finish what little was left. But in the West, the Eighth Army's ordeal was far from over. And despite many heroic individual unit stands, its disorganized retreat would not stop until the Imjin River 120 miles to the south, the longest retreat in U.S. military history. The principal difficulty of the Chinese army was often to remain in contact with the pursued, who were often pulling out faster than they could be hit. Fairly or not, the episode would be known in private gatherings of Korean soldiers as the Big Bug Out. An infuriated colonel raged at the collapse he saw going on around his own hard-fighting unit. He said, "This is a sight that hasn't been seen for hundreds of years. The men of a whole United States Army fleeing from a battlefield, abandoning their wounded, running for their lives."
One time when the ROK troops were overrun by the Chinese, and as their men retreated across a river, the South Korean officer executed all of the officers for having retreated. The South Koreans continued to get into the middle of the road, causing the convoy to stop. So I saw one of their officers, might have been a non-commissioned officer, grab one of the soldiers that was in the middle of the road and didn't want to move out, had a sergeant hold his arms back, and he literally beat him with his fist, took his tripod off his back and threw him off the side of the mountain. And those were the kinds of
Eighth Army had a scorched earth policy. We burned all the houses, killed all the livestock, destroyed all the foodstuffs. In the most terrible conditions for refugees I had ever seen in my life. We only had one road out, so they had to stay 100 meters off the road or be shot. You know, it was just bitter cold. Chinese hit and overran I Company on the high ground. Everything in my being said, get out now while you can. But I couldn't do that. I was a sergeant. I was a section leader. And those stripes weighed a ton.
The huge, disjointed retreat of the 8th Army from the Yalu was unnecessarily deep. More could have been successfully defended. A sergeant wept, shouting, "This isn't the goddamn American Army. Running away? We ought to be taking up positions." Retreating soldiers couldn't help remembering how the South Korean villages had cheered the sweep north. Then the UN troops were heroes and saviors. How bitterly that would change.
We had to retreat coming back through these same villages. Dead silence. No flags whatsoever. You feel you've betrayed these people.
The Washington planners fell into a deepening funk about how to explain the collapse. They fed the public the story that the Chinese attack had come on an unimaginable scale. But they knew that the defeats that had been inflicted by a lightly armed Third World Army attacking in numbers no greater than their own. And in the face of an opponent with utter command of the air and sea and possessed of virtually unlimited firepower. The cold was a terrible enemy, but it fell upon the Chinese as well as the Americans. 90% of them had frostbite. And they had crushing problems. The day was almost denied them by UN air power. Communications and supply were abysmal. A Red officer wrote, "Our soldiers frequently starve. They ate cold food, and some had only a few potatoes in 2 days."
The mood at that time was, we'd had it. The 2nd Division blocking force had been decimated. I mean, really, it had been torn to pieces by the Chinese. And we came back into position south of the 38th parallel, defeated in every sense of the word.
The retreat tumbled backward until the Chinese assault, unable to overtake the fleeing trucks of its prey, had outrun its supplies. But by now, the southern capital of Seoul was threatened again. The 8th Army's lines would not solidify until they were 50 miles south of the 38th parallel. An unimpressed foreign observer wrote of the American forces, "They have never studied or been taught defense. They appear only to have studied mechanized and mechanical advances at great speed. They do not understand locality defense in depth or all-around defense. The Americans do not understand infiltration and feel very naked when anybody threatens their flanks or rear." Bitter letters home summed up the feeling of many troops and spread to the population at home. A Bronx private wrote, "The Chinese are kicking hell out of the U.S. Army. If the big wheels in Washington decide to fight here, it will be the biggest mistake they ever made. We all feel we have been let down by our incompetent, blundering leadership from the White House down." Adding to the glum depression of these desperate hours was an escalating, sometimes irrational fury. Inevitably, this rage cried out for the ultimate weapon.
President Truman was tricked into being asked at a press conference whether he would use the atomic bomb to redress our defeat. He said he just might, and not only he might, but he would get General MacArthur to decide whether to use it.
At this frightening turn, the British Prime Minister Clement Attlee sped to Washington to head off a nuclear war with China. By now, the United States was willing to settle for a UN truce proposal restoring the pre-war borders of Korea, an already thunderous reversal of position. Also, Attlee insisted hotly to Truman that offering a UN seat to China represented the powerful negotiating carrot that would make the Chinese accept. An increasingly rancorous Congress and public was showing they had had their fill of Korea. Refusal to make a reasonable move to end the fighting would not be acceptable. But Acheson knew that in the past, the Chinese had refused to bargain in any way with the UN until they had been made members. He took a calculated risk that this stubborn short-sightedness would hold, and he agreed to the UN proposal that the United States did not want. His gamble succeeded as the Chinese spurned the offer.
Because the Chinese did turn it down, and then the United States, through Acheson, then could say that China was an aggressive nation, and he was able to get a motion through the United Nations calling the Chinese aggressors.
Quietly, out of sight of their allies, the Air Force began assembling nuclear target lists. The B-29s were ready to fly again. Senator McCarthy and his supporters were calling wildly for drastic action.
Mr. Chairman, I am getting rather sick of being interrupted in the middle of a sentence. Now, Mr. Chairman, do I have the floor now or do I not? What possibility of this ending except by victory or by death for this civilization?
They held a traitorous administration responsible for humiliation on the battlefield and called for the impeachment of Truman and the resignation of Marshall and Acheson. MacArthur sensed the administration's weakness and became increasingly hard to control, even as age and the shock of defeat began to edge him further from reality. It began to seem that it was going to depend on the ability of the crumbling forces on the Korean line to stem the Chinese assault as to whether or not the world was about to descend into a new nuclear nightmare. The American outlook for the Korean War seemed unrelievedly bleak. Any stabilization of the line south of the 38th parallel seemed more a function of the Chinese outrunning their supply lines than any effective defense. The demoralized UN troops saw little likelihood of holding on once the cocky and resolute enemy regrouped and resumed his pressure. Being captured was a terrifying experience, as treatment ranged from strictly proper to instant execution.
They put us in a little village one night, and I heard gunfire, and I thought that our troops were coming in. And the door opened, and it was North Korean with one of our submachine guns, stuck it in the door, and I happened to be next to the door, and he had the submachine gun right at my head, and I could feel a heat. I later found out that he had slaughtered about 20 of our guys in the hut next to us. And either the good Lord grabbed him or one of the Chinese grabbed him and pulled him away. And they took us back over from the North Koreans. The Chinese took us back.
Ironically, a tragic event back in mid-December, the death of a genuine hero of two American wars, would be instrumental to a crucial turnaround of the fighting. Nobody had ever doubted the courage and tenacity of General Walton Walker.
He was a small man in stature, but he was a mighty general.
And he did a magnificent job in the early days, in the difficult early days of the war.
But commanding the Eighth Army as it fell back, he was exhausted. And the huge retreat seemed beyond his experience and ability. Morale fell at his headquarters and in his army, as rumors rose that MacArthur was considering replacing the popular officer. On December 23rd, Walker had been driving from his headquarters when a truck cut off his Jeep. In an eerie repetition of the death of his mentor, George Patton, the fighting general died outside a battle in a mundane traffic accident. At this critical moment, General MacArthur made the very last of the brilliant and fateful decisions that had starred his fabled career. He replaced Walker with a bloody-minded warrior of dash and genius. General Matthew Bunker Ridgway had risen from lieutenant colonel to commanding general of the ferocious 82nd Airborne Division fighting in Sicily and Normandy. In 1944, he commanded airborne troops in the Ardennes. He possessed courage, brains, and decisiveness in abundance.
Ridgway put it back together. Ridgway is my nomination for the greatest fighting general, American general of the 20th century.
Ridgway's plan to get a counteroffensive going instantly were dashed by his first inspection. He would write, "This was a bewildered army, not sure of itself or its leaders, not sure what they were doing there, wondering when they would hear the whistle of that homebound transport." He wrote of his dismay at the lack of leadership and what he called the timidity about getting off the scanty roads, the reluctance to move without radio and telephone contact, and the lack of imagination in dealing with a foe whom they soon outmatched in firepower and dominated in the air and on the surrounding seas. Ridgway was going to have his capable hands full to overflowing.
The 8th Army G3 briefed him on the withdrawal plan, and Ridgway relieved him on the spot.
Reinforcements were arriving, but the cold and dehumanized replacement system called the pipeline was a miserable drag on morale. Individuals who had been together since basic training were torn away from their buddies.
The pipeline was designed to fill up holes in forces that needed to be filled up, but the individual was not considered to be important.
General MacArthur opened a second front in the war, this one against his political commanders. Repeatedly, he leaked and sometimes roared his messages over their heads to reach what he saw as a supporting American public. Truman issued a presidential order to all U.S. theater commanders, demanding extreme caution in all public pronouncements, which would have to be cleared with the Departments of State or Defense. He wanted no widening of this war. MacArthur called endlessly for more troops, more weapons, for carrying the war to the Chinese mainland with bombers and naval bombardment, for a blockade of the Chinese coast. He accused the Joint Chiefs of crippling his plans. He was a force of nature in the American psyche.
He started to lose some of his luster, particularly in Europe, who felt that this was a madman who was going to be slinging atom bombs around. And he certainly had lost his luster in the White House and over in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but he had lost none of his luster with the American people.
When Ridgway took over the Army, he had to reinstitute all of the fundamentals of infantry, complete perimeters, laying in machine guns at the right positions, ensuring that you used your firepower. All the fundamentals, all of the basics had to be stressed. Within 2 or 3 weeks, you could see the progress. Ridgway was adamant to get an offensive going. And as soon as he could, he started pushing the 8th Army north. And it was necessary to do that for the morale of those troops, for their fighting esprit, because he was dealing with a broken army.
Aside from Ridgway, no one much suspected that very soon it would be the Chinese Army's turn to be on the wrong end of the deadly surprises. Mao's estimation of a quick victory was bitterly wrong. With both sides having squandered solid chances for advantageous truces, the Korean War would stretch into its 2 bloodiest years. In mid-January of 1951, the GI on the line might have observed no change in the situation that had prevailed since the Chinese had intervened 6 weeks before. The steamrolling enemy appeared to be surging irresistibly across the 38th parallel as the 8th Army tried to find the morale, leadership, tactics, and strategy that would stabilize its position. But in fact, the situation had changed dramatically for the better.
The Chinese tactical cycle was advance, attack, and withdraw. Advance, attack, and withdraw. The reason for this was they didn't have the logistic systems to support a sustained offensive campaign. General Ridgway realized this quickly. He found the vulnerability. Thereafter, as soon as the Chinese started to withdraw, he would counterattack to disrupt this period of time where they could rearm and reorganize for the next offensive. This was a very successful innovation on the part of the 8th Army.
I see 2 flares going off, a red flare and a green flare, and I said to one guy, "What the hell is that?" He said, "The enemy's coming." Sure enough, there they came. Across the rice paddies and down the road they came. And believe it or not, we blew the shit out of them. There must have been at least 200 dead. The water was red from the blood.
The battleship Missouri, the famed Mighty Mo of World War II, had probably escaped the budget cutter's axe because it was named after President Truman's home state and had been christened by his daughter. And the troops were grateful for it, as her 16-inch rifles did awesome sharpshooting.
The 16-inch projectile weighs nearly a ton. It's nearly as tall as a man. It has an explosive power to create a crater 30 feet across when it hits the target. They can go over the top of a mountain, come back and hit a target on the other side, and with great explosive power. Those kept a lot of heads down.
We pretty much shut down the North Korean coast. We bombarded targets ashore with our gunfire, knocking out locomotives, boxcars, railroad tunnels on occasion, bridges, highways.
Again, the pragmatic Chinese commander, Marshal Peng, suggested offering the UN a ceasefire. Instead, Mao ordered a new offensive and made the worst mistake of the war.
The Chinese had the best chance ever to cease fire at a position of great strength, and it would have made all the difference in the world, not only in lives saved on both sides, but for the Chinese themselves. They would have had this aura of invincibility, having thrown back the 8th Army and the 10th Corps from the Yalu, driven them all the way back south of the 38th parallel, and shown the world that China was in fact a new world power to be reckoned with. It was a blown opportunity of the highest magnitude.
The U.S. tactics were back to the ones that had proved so devastating in World War II. Units advancing in line and attacking and defending with earth-shaking, man-killing firepower. Ridgway perceived that the war of slashing maneuver across the narrow peninsula had ended. there were no especially strategic targets or real estate to go after. There was only the matter of killing the enemy in massive numbers with his massive ordnance, and with an even greater weapon, a revitalized army.
In a way, we went into Korea with a lousy army, one that was not prepared to fight, one that thought its duties were simply occupation duties in Japan. But that army toughened up, particularly after General Ridgway got out there and took charge. The 8th Army soon became a fine fighting army, as good as anything that the country had ever fielded.
It would have to be good. The frustrated Chinese began to hurl themselves furiously against the foe that they had been holding in utter contempt. They broke through South Korean forces and devastated them, along with a small U.S. force sent to support them. It seemed a replay of previous actions, with the Chinese racing to cut off the retreat. But now, under Ridgway, 5th Cavalry tanks came up to support the 23rd Infantry's gritty defense. The Chinese were stopped cold. Ridgway gave them no chance to recover. He launched an 8-division, 100,000-man counteroffensive. He called it Operation Killer, and it would live up to its name. With the war and the focus falling steadily onto Ridgway, MacArthur was missing the spotlight. He had turned up in Ridgway's command tent at the start of the push.
MacArthur came into the tent, looked at all the plans, and then turned to the newspaper people who were there and says, "I have just ordered a resumption of the attack," implying that he had done it, when actually it had been Ridgway's idea all along.
Operation Killer melted seamlessly into Operation Ripper. Another engagement meant as much to punish the enemy as to take ground. The forces plowed steadily north to Phase Line, Idaho, one of many successive and essentially meaningless lines in the mud to be designated by state names. By March 14th, the advance had retaken for the second time what remained of Seoul. While the brass debated whether to cross the 38th parallel again, they realized that something had to be done to give respite to the bone-weary GIs who had been fighting up and down the peninsula for months without a physical or psychological rest. Out of desperate need, the 8th Army launched a policy of sending troops to Japan for 5 days of what they called rest and recuperation. Quickly shortened to R&R, the policy became a Korean fighter's dream.
It was really something, the way you went from hell to heaven in a few short hours. Smooth roads, running water, great food, soft beds. And there was something about the YMCA that we stayed at the first couple of nights that you came down for breakfast, that great American breakfast food just smelled so great. It was pretty exhilarating. After 5 days, as crazy as it seems, I started to worry about the guys in the section, and I didn't mind going back.
On March 27, 1951, Ridgway's troops recrossed the 38th parallel. But this time, nobody contemplated a run for the Yalu. The goals were concrete, limited, and taken in turn. The Communists, becoming acutely aware of their enemy's strengthening capabilities, determined to reverse the situation. they began to plan a World War II-scale spring offensive to unleash 19 Chinese armies to undo Ridgway's miracles. Meanwhile, General MacArthur would not be checked. As the administration maneuvered to contain the situation while trying to disengage, the old soldier raved on. He proposed massive air attacks against China, sowing no man's land with radioactive waste, and massive amphibious operations behind the front. He accused his allies of conspiring against him and howled for the rescue of the Korean people. On April 5th, a shockingly indiscreet letter from MacArthur to Republican Representative Joseph Martin was read to the House. By indirection, MacArthur let the nation know, with all his famous rhetorical flourishes, all the things he had been forbidden to trumpet. The letter's ringing closing words, "There is no substitute for victory," would endure forever, rally the American people to his support, and seal his professional doom. President Truman had already made up his mind to fire MacArthur, writing, "I could no longer tolerate his insubordination." The decision was not an easy one, because while anyone in a high position among the administration and its overseas allies agreed with the removal, the opposition of hometown America would be uproarious.
It was with the deepest personal regret that I found myself compelled to take this action. General MacArthur is one of our greatest military commanders, but the cause of world peace is much more important than any individual.
The commander who had given a brilliant military career to his country ended up learning his fate only after it had been broadcast to the world. He observed that he had been publicly humiliated after 52 years in the Army. The rage and consternation among the American people was every bit as furious as anticipated.
We do not know where we're going in Korea. We do not know where we're going in China. MacArthur knows, and he's been fired.
The Japanese public mourned a figure that had been their forgiving savior in the post-war nation. If MacArthur looked for his ultimate validation from the common people of the nation he had served, he got it in the fullest measure. From ocean to ocean, tumultuous crowds boomed out their affection in tons of ticker tape and hoarse cheers of gratitude and approval.
He saw himself as a victor whose will had been defied, and he had been betrayed by the politicians. He felt no guilt at all. He felt that he would have achieved what he had set out to do in Korea as his crowning glory. But he had been betrayed by Truman and the hacks around Truman, including his fellow military officers.
He took his grand finale to the highest podium of the government that had dismissed him. In a deeply emotional address before the Congress, the greatest actor who had ever worn a military uniform bid goodbye to a tearful nation.
When I joined the Army, it was the fulfillment of all my boyish hopes and dreams. That old soldiers never die. They just fade away. I now close my military career and just fade away.
As politicians churned in meaningless investigation of the dismissal, Matthew Ridgway became the Supreme Commander, Far East Command. By April of 1951, the political leadership of the UN knew the war in Korea was not going to end in victory. The calls of those who wanted to fight for some ultimate triumph would never completely stop. But the realists knew that the Chinese colossus would not be dislodged without an unacceptable, unstrategic widening of the Cold War. General Omar Bradley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, put it bluntly, saying taking on Red China would involve us in the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. After 4 months of bravura leadership, Ridgway, moving up to replace MacArthur in Supreme Command, appointed Lieutenant General James Van Fleet to lead the 8th Army. Van Fleet was bright and imaginative, and no stranger to violent combat. He had been wounded in World War I, led an assault regiment on D-Day in Normandy, and commanded an army corps across France. It was a sturdy choice. Van Fleet took quick stock of the situation he had inherited in the 10th month of the war. The hot forge of combat had produced sweeping changes in the abilities and makeup of his forces. Much of the news was good. The South Korean army, poorly led and equipped in the early days of the war, and so likely to break quickly that the communists preferred to attack them, was solidifying into a big, tough fighting force. They would bear a huge part of the fighting and take and inflict a lion's share of casualties. A program called Katusa, Korean augmentation to the U.S. Army, flourished after a faltering start.
There was a language problem and they had no training. Finally, we did the best thing we could, which was to pair them off in a buddy system. One Korean, one American. While they were green and scared and like a lot of us, they developed into darn good soldiers. They were willing, and it was their country they were fighting for, and we became very fond of them.
An unvarying high card in the commander's hand was the generally superb professionalism of the elite fighting units of the other UN contingents. Soldiers of the United Kingdom, Canada, Turkey, Australia, France, Greece, Thailand, the Philippines, Belgium, Luxembourg, Colombia, and Ethiopia were utterly effective and reliable in battle. Van Fleet also had a good idea of what the UN domination of the skies could do for him, and what it couldn't do.
The Korean War caught the United States Air Force by surprise, just like it caught our other services by surprise, so it was very much what we would term a come-as-you-are party. We had some F-51 Mustangs in theater, which of course were the legendary P-51 of World War II. We had a limited number of F-80 Shooting Stars, which were a first-generation turbojet combat airplane, and then for strategic bombing, we had B-29s on call. We had B-26 medium bombers, which were a very fine twin-engine attack aircraft.
Even this obsolescent force had been able to wrest control of the skies early on from a weakling North Korean Air Force. Its performance against road targets moving in daylight was every bit as powerful as anticipated. Joining carrier-based fighters and bombers, they interdicted the North Korean and Chinese offensive significantly. But there were disappointments. The mountainous terrain of Korea offered many more meandering trails than main highways. And with an enemy geared to carrying his basic needs on his back along those trails, the air campaign to strangle the enemy of supplies was a long and costly disappointment. Losses to ground fire soared. In the war's early days, the propeller-driven B-29s that had brought Japan to its knees functioned powerfully in the target-rich environment of the fast-moving communist offensives. Worthwhile industrial targets were pitifully few, but operating confidently in broad daylight, planes devastated rail yards and close-packed troops and supply dumps. The communists would have a harsh rejoinder.
The technology of air warfare was changing so rapidly that the relative invulnerability that the B-29 had enjoyed in World War II was a thing of the past. The B-29's principal opponent in the Korean War was the Soviet MiG-15, an aircraft that had been designed in the post-World War II era precisely to shoot down the B-29 aircraft. It was indeed quite vulnerable to the MiG-15 aircraft, and we had to take B-29 operations and basically operate them at night.
Suddenly, the UN pilots had to search the skies as well as the ground. MiG-15s flying from Chinese sanctuary behind the Yalu were attacking south in significant formations in a short corridor that came to be called MiG Alley. And the pilots were often Soviet airmen honing their war skills.
Soviets were sending fighter regiments into the Far East, down to Korea, and rotating these regiments through. We recognized very, very quickly from the Allied side that we would have to very quickly upgrade our forces. In late November of 1950, we arranged for the shipping of the F-86 Sabre, a first-generation swept-wing jet fighter with very refined aerodynamic performance, a very clean, elegant design, to the Far East.
The Sabre, superior and skillfully flown, quickly gained an awesome superiority over the MiG-15. By the time the Korean War ended, the American jet had outkilled the Red fighter by a ratio of 10 to 1. In the last week of April 1951, the most ferocious assaults in the biggest Chinese offensive of the war fell on Republic of Korea divisions in the west along the Imjin River and in the center at the key road junction of Kapyang. The ROKs collapsed, leaving wide gaps in the line and exposing adjacent units to the tidal wave pouring through. Chinese commissars were promising to celebrate May Day in Seoul. The British brigade was left terribly exposed. Most fought clear of the encirclement, but the Gloucester Battalion couldn't get out. They fought one of the great last stands.
They would call it Gloucester Hill. Here, 800 men of the Gloucester Battalion of the British Brigade would fight against a Chinese division for 5 days and nights, completely surrounded. Every one of our relief efforts failed miserably, and in the end they were overwhelmed and snuffed out. Less than 50 men escaped with their lives. General Van Fleet would call this the most outstanding example of unit bravery in the history of modern warfare. When the Army's 92nd Field Artillery Battalion found themselves cut off and surrounded by the latest Chinese breakthrough, they simply circled their wagons, aimed these 155mm self-propelled guns directly at the surrounding Chinese, filled in the gaps with cannon cockers serving as infantrymen, and held on for 2 days and nights.
There were wounded men all over. The battery exec was dead. My friend Robbie, the section chief, his wrists were gone. Stumps of his wrists spurting blood. And this quick-thinking guy just reached down and grabbed him by the wrists. And even though the tourniquets were applied, he wouldn't let go until the doctor saw him and they took him to the aid station. I happened to be whistling that day, that afternoon, and it took me 40 years before I could whistle again.
After 8 violent days, the great communist offensive sputtered to a close. The 8th Army had been forced back an average of 35 miles, and they had suffered 7,000 casualties. But they had saved Seoul, salvaged their pride, and methodically inflicted some 70,000 casualties on the communists. Both the Army and the Marine Corps had begun racial integration of combat units in August 1950, with splendid results. The Black Warriors had arrived at last as full fighting partners. After the disastrous attempts at the war's beginning to employ all black units, the old segregated outfits were dissolved.
Up until Korea, I considered the American forces very immature in the attitudes that they had about race. I think that the maturity came around Daegu and Yongsan, Hungnam, all of those various areas where we got to see the character of the guy standing next to us. You didn't see him anymore as black, white, or brown. You just saw him as Marine Green.
The goals were no longer a northward sprint to the Yalu River for the UN, or a huge smash to Pusan for the communists. The battles were now forehead-to-forehead slugfests to consolidate positions for dug-in defensive lines. The forces fought for threadbare prizes called the Punch Bowl, the Iron Triangle, and Pork Chop Hill, where blood bought little but scarcely improved positions to burrow into with shovels and bulldozers. The murderous, stalemated Western Front of 1918 had arrived in Korea in 1951. By mid-1951, the communist leadership tasted the bitter pill. There would be no battlefield victory. The economy of China was crumbling under the war's costs. The Russians were demanding payment for the arms and ammunition they supplied. UN determination was unmistakable. By July 10th, UN and communist delegations were meeting to begin ceasefire talks. There was talk of an end of the war in 60 days.
I find it difficult to understand the motives of the Chinese communist leaders in continuing their aggression.
Ridgway, ever the grim realist, warned, to sit down with these men and deal with them as a representative of an enlightened and civilized people is to deride one's own dignity and to invite the disaster their treachery will bring upon us. Those who loudly professed national embarrassment by the veteran general's bellicose words would have to eat their own words soon enough. Ahead lay a shocking 2 more years of a war that would become futile, disheartening, and increasingly forgotten at home. The communists would engineer a dismal tragedy for both sides. Preliminary negotiations of groups led by Vice Admiral Turner Joy on the UN side and North Korean General Nam Il foundered almost at once. The communist attitude was to make it all appear as a UN capitulation. Every half step was bogged down in an interminable morass of ranting communist rhetoric. Tensions mounted. On one day, the delegations stared at one another in stony silence for 2 hours. While talks were broken off, the Reds used the time to improve their positions and bring up artillery. That made a UN drive to 19 miles north of the 38th parallel miserably costly.
One hill after another, and then we'd lose it, and then we'd go back and retake it, and all the people that were killed during that time, I often wondered what the Pentagon and other people thought about, so why are they doing that?
This cost the United Nations, mostly Americans, 60,000 casualties, and it cost the Communists as many as 300,000.
General Van Fleet, the 8th Army commander, felt that we could improve our position to some degree by attacking and seizing a few of these hills. But the argument that he mainly raised was that the morale of the soldiers would decline unless they were actively involved in operations.
Those deadly morale builders would continue for years as negotiations resumed at the neutral site of Panmunjom. From here on in, it would be bloody, never-decisive patrols and battalion-sized firefights, with talk of the final demarcation line being the spot where the fighting ended. The Chinese tried through the months to grind forward to better their position.
The weekly covers of Time magazine for 1951 reflect this shift in the national mood. The 1st of January, the man of the year is a U.S. infantryman, G.I. Joe. And in those first 6 months of 51, you had on the cover General Ridgway twice, General MacArthur, General Van Fleet, even the Pentagon. But after the middle of the year, nothing. The whole war had just disappeared.
The coming of stalemate didn't slow the heroism or the heartache. In battles like the one around the hill called Old Baldy, strong men had their hearts cracked.
It was the ugliest feeling of my life to carry down my buddies that were dead. That was the saddest day of my life. These were guys that you played with, you had fun with, you joked with. They were gone. 21, 22-year-old young Americans.
During the last dreary months of the war, American troops became obsessed with the point system that had been put into place to establish priority for rotation home. It was based on combat zones. Hot combat zones were worth the most points per month, supposed safe zones the least. 36 points sent you home. Discussions of 4, 3, or 2-point zones never stopped.
I was going to a 4-point area, and Richie was going to a 2-point area, so we didn't want to be separated. He said, come with me, so we'll get home earlier. He was killed in that battle. I always blame myself for this fella. He was a young kid, he was only 19 years old.
The UN prisoners taken by the communists had to endure a separate hell, one marked by murder, malnutrition, beating, and an attempt to brainwash their spirit.
You can't beat a man and starve him and expect him to say that their way of life is better than yours when you have the freedom that we know.
The greatest sticking point in the painfully protracted negotiations was the fate of 132,000 Chinese and Korean prisoners held in camps by the UN. Despite brutal attempts by communist cadres to enforce and demonstrate red spirit and discipline in the camps, their high leaders felt that an embarrassing number would choose not to return north.
I think we can take pride in the fact, as a nation, as a humanitarian nation, that we did not force these people to go back, although at a tremendous price.
Not the least of the UN problems was Syngman Rhee. The South Korean leader was adamantly against ending the war and threatened to continue it on his own to torpedo the peace process. To that end, without waiting for negotiations that might force the repatriation of many Chinese and North Korean prisoners who wanted to defect, he released 25,000 of those who had declared a wish not to return north. The United States was furious.
A contingency plan was put together, Plan Ever Ready, was to seize Syngman Rhee in case it was necessary and to take him out of the control of the South Korean government.
By the summer of 1952, World War II veteran General Mark Clark had replaced Ridgway, who had moved to Europe to succeed Dwight Eisenhower as commander of the NATO armies. Meanwhile, Truman had declined to seek another term, and Dwight Eisenhower was nominated to become the President of the United States. Heeding the national cry to be rid of this war, he had made a largely symbolic promise that he would make an end to it, whatever the howls from the McCarthyites and MacArthur. He said, "I shall go to Korea." For the bitter, exhausted soldiers, there sprang up a faint shimmer of hope that the politicians would not totally forget they were still there, in hell. Two weeks after he was elected president in 1952, Dwight Eisenhower kept his promise to go to Korea. His three-day visit solidly reaffirmed the need to get the U.S. and the UN out of there, and fast. There were events to help him. Stalin, the arch-communist and foe, died in 1953. And while there is no sure way of knowing that the successful test by the United States of a nuclear artillery shell was crucial to breaking the communist negotiating logjam, it certainly didn't hurt.
The final repatriation agreement called for an international body to supervise the exchange of prisoners. Essentially what it came down to was that the persons who refused to go back to their homeland were given the opportunity to reconsider for a brief period, and then if they wanted to go on to their homeland, they could do so, or if they wanted to go back where they'd been imprisoned, they could also do so. A good number of the Chinese and a good number of the North Koreans refused to go home, and they were sent either back to Taiwan or they were sent to South Korea. Only a very few Americans and a very few Europeans refused to go back.
To drive home to Syngman Rhee for a final time their fighting will and South Korean vulnerability, the Communists launched a last 100,000-man offensive against the ROK part of the line. As had become standard, the South Koreans bent backward before the Reds were answered with withering firepower that stopped them cold. The UN suffered 17,000 casualties in the 20 days it took Syngman Rhee to agree to the truce. He did not sign the armistice agreement, threatening to the end to obstruct it. At 10 a.m. on July 27, 1953, 2 years and 17 days since talks began, and after 18 million transcribed words had been spoken at 575 meetings, the truce was signed. General Clark would bitterly regret becoming, he said, the first U.S. Army commander in history to sign an armistice without a victory.
We were to cease firing by 10 p.m. at night. At 8 o'clock, as it grew dark, small arms fire was exchanged between our positions and the enemy positions. By 9:30, there was constant firing of virtually all weapons from both sides until the final remnants of a small arms round here and there were heard and a final flare or two whispered on its way to the ground. I remember looking up at the sky at that time. The stars were beautiful and sparkling. I thought, the war is over, and nobody should die on a night like this.
The war had stopped, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of lives later, right where it had started. And just like that, the troops were coming home. Packed transports sailed out of Incheon and Busan and Japan. If the reception at home was far from thunderous in the streets, it was as heartfelt as any homecoming of U.S. fighting men in history.
My mother, she received a telegram I was missing in action on December the 1st of 1950. She heard no other word, had no other word, until December, the day before Christmas, 1951, that my name was on a prisoner of war list. But she really didn't know until I got off the boat at San Francisco, and she put her arms around me. She said, "Welcome home, son."
As far as the rest of the American public, there was no reception. I joined the Staten Island chapter of Korean Vets 2 years ago, and that's when I got my real reception.
The end of the battle would only put the Korean War into remission. For the rest of the century and beyond, the 38th parallel would prove a center of relentless enmity between a paranoid North and a permanently wary South. United States troops would be combat ready in Korea into the next millennium.
Someone that's bold enough to step on little people. I think that if you don't stop them at that point, then they continue to do so.
This so-called forgotten war had costs that dwarfed far more famous conflicts. The United States alone had some 147,000 casualties, with over 33,000 dead in battle. More than 400,000 dead and wounded were suffered by other UN contingents, including the South Korean armed forces. North Korean and Chinese casualties are unknown, even in Peiping and Pyongyang. But without question, they ran into hundreds of thousands. The absence of UN victory in the Korean War doesn't overshadow the disaster the war became to world communism. Its naked aggression had been met head-on, stopped, slaughtered, and frustrated by a formidable coalition of free world countries who were not ready for war. The sleeping United States, with its almost disbanded military, snapped to agonized attention and committed its wealth and might to building a permanent armed bulwark that would never fade again. The divided Korean peninsula became a side-by-side laboratory study of communist misery and free world prosperity. And if the men who fought the war went into it without the weapons, training, and leadership they deserved, they turned it around with blood, courage, and sacrifice that stands at the heights among the fighters in any war that freedom ever fought.